Hey guys, my name is Jordan Koss. Welcome to the Almost Essential podcast. This 16-episode series is based off my final project for my Doctorate of Ministry degree at Fuller Theological Seminary. The title of that final project is Almost Essential Evangelists, Improving Retirement Asset Accumulation for Mainstream Church of Christ Pastors. In this series, we will interview 8 different specialists in 8 separate episodes. And we will also interview 2 pastors from each of 8 different regions around the U.S. This final project was inspired by 10 years of ministry in 3 different churches of Christ from Georgia to Northern California from 2010 to 2019, as well as my time as a financial professional in training in 2020. That is where I learned about the retirement crisis America is in and will be experiencing in the coming years. Now, I have 3 goals for this podcast. 1, provide an accessible, denomination-specific qualitative conversation for Church of Christ pastors and leaders. 2, introduce leaders and listeners to retirement vehicles and strategies they may not have heard about before. And 3, provide encouragement, motivation, and knowledge to save for the last third of life. Thank you for listening and enjoy. All right, welcome to the Almost Essential podcast. This is your host, Jordan Koss, and this is episode 15. This is, we're getting close to the end here of our 16 episode series. This is the last, number 8 of our pastor conversation and interviews with Church of Christ pastors from around the country. And we are fittingly ending with Texas. Texas is the, if you will, the heart of the Bible Belt in terms of churches of Christ. It has as I'm sure these 2 guys that we're going to talk with today, has the most churches of Christ, buildings, churches in general, as well as congregants on the roll out of all the states in our union. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation we're going to have tonight. But first, Lars, our co-host, say a few words about yourself, man.
Yeah, Jordan, I think a few of these episodes, we've talked a little bit about our friendship starting on a sailboat because a church relations guy named Jeff Walling in our movement was moved back to Pepperdine and got some youth ministers together. And that's how we started to kind of climbing up a mast. And now we're, co-hosting a podcast. So it's been several years of our friendship. And a lot of theology in there. I got my master's at Fuller Seminary, and that's where you're getting your doctorate. So it's a lot of camaraderie and some exciting things. I feel like I'm getting to learn some things from you as you're being a dad, and I'm a little behind you in that. But also, I'm just super grateful for your willingness to write and to be diligent. I'm more of the extrovert people person, and you're definitely a deep thinker who also cares deeply about people. And so I'm really grateful for some of your writing, and I'm grateful for our friendship. And I serve as the director of university relations at Bushnell and doing my own church relations stuff now for pastors in the Pacific Northwest out of Eugene, Oregon. So grateful to be part of it, and excited to talk to my friends in Church of Christ Mecca down in Texas.
And with that, let's go ahead, and Aaron, why don't you be the first to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name's Aaron Scott. I grew up in Weatherford, Texas, just about 30 miles west of Fort Worth, at a pretty decent sized congregation. It was about 400 to 500 most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to Lubbock Christian University, got a degree in biblical text, and then got my first job in youth ministry at Davis Park in Modesto, California, where I met my wife. And then I was there for about 3 years, and then I was in Fresno at College Church of Christ for about 5 years as the youth minister. And then while I was there, I started working on my MDiv at LCU. Well, I started at Lipscomb and then went to LCU for several reasons. For one thing, it was half the price, but anyways. But went to LCU, transitioned to LCU for my MDiv, finished that up, and in the process of that, ended up in Levelland, Texas, which is about 30 miles west of Lubbock, and I preached there for about 4.5 years.
Okay.
And now I'm back in Weatherford, and I'm actually a roofing contractor, but still doing lots of ministry at South Main. I teach a young adults class and have a small group with them. And then that's every other week. Well, I teach it every Sunday, but then every other week we have a small group, and then I have a young family small group that I lead as well, doing a worship theology sort of class on Wednesday nights. So a little bit of everything, the wonderful volunteer that they wish they had that has some training. So kind of cool.
That's great. That's great. Thanks for saying that about yourself, and thanks for being here tonight. Jarrod, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, Jarrod Robinson. I grew up on the West Coast. My dad's in ministry, or just until recently, congregational ministry. So I grew up seeing that, and went to Abilene Christian University. Kind of always thought I would go to Pepperdine, but let's see, it was '96 or so when I was going to school, and my dad really wanted me to go to ACU. I had never heard of ACU. I had never been to Abilene. I got accepted. Parents drove me out and left me here. And yeah, it was a lot of culture shock, but I ended up getting a chance to start preaching basically every Sunday my freshman year. Little towns have little churches all around Abilene that need fill-ins on Sunday morning. And so just, have been doing that basically since I was 18. And stayed at ACU through my undergraduate and my MDiv, graduated in 2003. Left, I guess I should say, fell in love with a girl from Houston. And the first thing her parents said was, please don't take our daughter to California. And I promptly took her to the Bay Area, a place called Antioch, California, kind of a bedroom community from San Francisco. And so was only there for about 2.5 years, and just kind of felt like we were probably never going to be able to afford a house, and kind of figure all that out, and had an opportunity to preach at a church in North Dallas in an area called Coppell. Was there for 8 years, and then about 8 years ago moved from there to Southern Hills Church of Christ in Abilene, where I've been ever since.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you for being here tonight as well, Jarrod. And from a few things you've mentioned so far before we start our recording, I believe it's going to be a really good conversation, you guys. So thanks once again. Let's go ahead and jump into question number 1. And you were asked to read chapter 2 of my research that I've written so far, and that had to do with foundational vehicles for retirement, or basically what vehicles might help Church of Christ pastors better to financially prepare for retirement, to acquire assets for retirement better than perhaps what they've done, at least what we've seen in James Knapp's 2 studies, as well as what perhaps we see in the ACU salary survey every year for those who take that. And so one of the things, I'll mention one thing, and I'll ask you to kind of, hey, what stuck out to you the most, get your thoughts. I started out by just analyzing 2 recent authors, Christian authors who wrote a couple books about Christian finances. Some of them were geared toward ministers, some were not. But Art Rainer, Tom Rainer's son, a lot of people perhaps know who Tom Rainer is, but Art Rainer's son wrote 2 books on this subject. And there's another one you could readily find on Amazon. C.J. Cagle wrote 3 books. And after analyzing what they had to say, it really was kind of what you could say is like they pretty much were saying the same thing that Dave Ramsey has said and continues to say, and they're heirs of his legacy, who himself builds off of Christian financial advisors like Larry Burkett and Ron Blue and Howard Dayton and Randy Alcorn. But there was like one issue that came to my mind as I was writing this analysis, and after writing and reading what Teresa Ghilarducci said in her book, like Rescuing Retirement, and that is what Dave Ramsey says to do. His basic approach according to Ghilarducci, is that kind of leads one towards the DIY retirement crisis of an over-reliance on ineffective vehicles like defined contribution plans like the 401k and the IRA, and being over-reliant upon Social Security. Let me what do you let me just first ask you this question. Like, what stuck out to you most from this chapter in light of like looking at it from that angle?
Go ahead, Jared.
Uh, my wife was an accounting major at ACU, and so she handles the majority of our home budgeting and all that kind of stuff. I'll talk more about this in a little while. My church has some assistance in helping me figure that out, but honestly, most of that stuff was brand new to me. I've only really heard about, basically doing some sort of mixed mutual funds that are in a retirement account. I mean, that's it. I didn't even know that the life insurance or the whole, whatever it was called, that was all brand new to me. I hadn't heard anything about that before. So,
all right. So you had never heard about Index Universal Life ever before. Yeah, in 2020, when I was preparing to be a financial professional, most conversations I would have with people, and a lot of them were like members in Church of Christ, like, I've never heard about this before. So interesting. Aaron, what about you? What's jumped out at you when you first read it?
Well, so I had very little information before I got into ministry. And so as I was, a little bit of background in 2018, at Cactus Drive, we had a little bit of a pretty large shortfall. And I wasn't sure in looking at finances, even though we had a pretty large savings account, what was going to happen. And so one of the things I did during that time was I actually went and got my life and health insurance license, where I learned about IULs and the fixed index stuff as well.
Yeah, FIA.
FIAs. And I learned a lot more about them then, but that was the first I'd ever heard about them. And learned more about the value of those. But at the time, we were still digging ourselves out of a hole, which I'll talk more about later. So I knew about some of those things, and still know and I knew about more of them than probably a lot of people, but yeah. So I really like the idea of the IUL. I think it's a lot better vehicle than an IRA and a lot of those other things. But yeah. So.
Okay. Oh, good stuff. And so I guess what I explored in that chapter was like, okay, if what Teresa Ghilarducci is saying is correct, and perhaps it's not the best idea to always pursue what Dave Ramsey has to say, and when we had Teresa Ghilarducci on, one of the things she said is like, he kind of speaks to the top 10%, the people with money, kind of the rich. And so like Church of Christ pastors aren't part of the top 10% most of the time, you could easily say. And so what could they do? What financial vehicles could possibly work better for them, especially in light of, like, say, what I write about in chapter 3, theology, like what financial vehicles could perhaps help us fulfill the Nazareth Manifesto and make this preparing for retirement financially more of a communal thing than an individualistic thing. And so I dove into the talking about and writing about IULs, which is what I learned when I dove into the life insurance world as well, and back in 2020, and I realized, hey, this might be good for pastors, for Church of Christ ministers. And so I wrote about what Doug Andrew had to say, what Patrick Kelly had to say about IULs, and it's not readily known. People, this information about a lot of people have never heard about this before. I definitely didn't before 2020. And so I keep referencing Doug Andrews' name and Patrick Kelly's name, and I really haven't dove into what the IULs are or what they have to say about it in this podcast yet. So I wanted to read a couple paragraphs here to you guys right now in terms of what these are, so that our listeners and viewers can kind of get a better idea. And another thing that you guys could do, our listeners and viewers, is jump on the YouTube and find Doug Andrews' YouTube channel. He's got a ton of videos trying to explain this as well. He's got a recent book out called The Laser Fund as well that you can look up as well. So, but let me read to you these first couple paragraphs. So rather than the 401k and individual retirement accounts being the foundation of one's retirement savings, Doug Andrew recommends laser funds. Laser funds, laser stands for the 4 essentials of prudent financial vehicles, and that's liquidity, safety, predictable rates of return, and tax advantages. Now, Andrew ranks liquidity as most important, which he says is the ability to access your money when you need it or want it. He ranks safety second, which relates to the safety of the principal from loss due to market volatility, as well as the track record and reliability of the financial institution. He ranks rates of return third, which refers to the need for a competitive rate of return that historically has beaten inflation and is ideally under tax favorable circumstances. And finally, tax advantage refers to financial strategies that help you avoid paying unnecessary taxes and safeguard against outliving your money in retirement. And he created this laser rating system, revealing, at least to him, which financial vehicles score the highest and therefore also function the best for retirement savings and income. And the primary financial vehicle that passes this laser test is, surprise, surprise, it's the IUL, which he calls the IUL, the laser fund. Which is essentially a tax-advantaged, maximum-funded IUL life insurance policy. He says it is essentially self-insurance or self-insuring your own death benefit. As a result, the policyholder becomes their own fiduciary or self-proprietor, which he believes is preferable to relying on the government or one's job to provide retirement security. And Andrew believes that the laser fund should be your primary retirement planning strategy and therefore foundation and base that allows you to then build a balanced retirement portfolio upon. He's like, you can get a 401k or a 403b or IRA, but he's like, that shouldn't be your foundation. He's like, the IUL is what should be your foundation. And I'll stop there. So like, guys, reading about, the IUL is difficult to understand. I still don't get it all, even though I was supposed to like tell people about it. What did you pick up about the IUL? Does it seem like interesting to like kind of pursue getting one after reading this chapter, or what? Like, are you still kind of like nah, or what do you think?
I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It just made me curious about not only how they work, but they kept talking about kind of the best timing on when to do that. I'm 44 years old. It's like, okay, so how does that work?
Right.
There was, when you were in the chapter, you were kind of referencing that Ramsey and other people, when they're kind of criticizing it, are always talking about the cost of the premium. So that made me wonder, okay, what are they talking about there?
Right.
I didn't know as much about, I think they criticize like the people who actually invest the money or whatever. They don't think are as good as other people, which, other financial people, which seems like a kind of a random guess or judgment call or whatever. But the key thing I wondered was how would I know if this was the best thing for me at my age, 44 years old? I'm a cancer survivor.
Okay.
So how does that affect me?
So
those
you might not be able to qualify then because it is life insurance. You might not be able to qualify. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Aaron, what about you?
Man, in my learning about it, in the process of getting my life and health insurance license that I let lapse last year because I didn't want anything to do with it.
I know. I don't blame you.
You have to turn every conversation into life insurance conversations, and it's brutal. But one of the things about one of the things that is scary about it is, at my age at 38 or Jared's age at 44, to get the benefit of it, it's expensive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not to get the benefit of the retirement as well as the death benefit and all that sort of stuff. It's not cheap to fund.
Yeah.
But the second
Like, what
part of
are we
that,
talking about?
like if you're looking, I don't remember the numbers, but if you're looking at like $1 million of insurance or whatever that has liquidity to it, you're talking $400 to $600, $800 a month.
Okay.
It's not cheap. Whereas the younger you start, the higher the death benefit and stuff that you can build
Okay.
cheaper. So it's really beneficial if you can start like with your kids, and then that benefit gets bigger because as they get older, they can start funding it more.
Yeah, that $1 million baby reference or whatever in the chapter.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. Like people are starting to use IULs instead of 529 plans because of there are more benefits. It is argued more benefits to the IUL using it that way to fund college, etc., than a 529. Yeah. Let me read this section. We kind of answer your question, Jarrod, about like what are we talking about when we're talking about funding. So Andrew talks about how one positive of an IUL is its flexibility. He says another aspect of flexibility relates to the ability of laser funds to provide equal opportunity benefits for people of various financial means and not just for the wealthy, because it's often thought IULs is just for rich people to stash money away so they don't have to pay taxes on it or something like that. Laser funds are considered the rich man's Roth. They've been called that, as they are ideal for high net worth individuals and can be funded with millions of dollars in as few as 5 years, which you cannot do with traditional vehicles like a 401k or Roth IRA, etc. But Andrew offers an analogy for this 5-year max funded laser fund with his own fund with owning and fully renting out a 5-floor apartment building in 5 years. But he says laser funds can also be designed as starter plans with moderate contributions of $200, $500, or $1,000 each month as well. So here he gives an example. Andrew offers the illustration of a policyholder putting in $500 aside each month from 25 to 65 years of age. According to his illustration, they end up having $1.3 million in their policy with the ability to take out $100,000 to $130,000 a year in tax-free income in retirement for the rest of their life. He also gives another example saying Andrew offers a starting younger scenario where a policy owner pays $1,000 each month for 30 years from 40 to 7 years of age for the purpose of retirement income. The policy's death benefit grows to $1.6 million by year 30 as the policyholder begins to take out an annual income of $125,520. And if they live for 30 or more years, they would have received a total of about $3.7 million in total retirement income tax-free, as well as leaving $650,000 of death benefit for their heirs, tax-free as well. These are two possible and realistic illustrations, one could say, for pastors and their families. Depend upon what church you work for, etc., and what you're paid, if it's realistic or not. But that seemed to be okay. It's like if it's that makes perhaps they are doable for pastors, full-time pastors working in churches of Christ. But again, it's all on when do you start and can you take advantage of this? So those are a couple examples of starter plans. When you heard that, Jarrod, like, what are your thoughts?
I wish I read financial books when I was 25. That was my thought. It's not been a focus. It was not a focus of my parents' life. And, since my dad was a minister, in fact, I don't know that this is the time to tell you this or not, but he counseled me to opt out of Social Security.
Okay.
Because he thought I could do better with, not paying that in. And I'm not sure he's wrong in terms of the state of probably what Social Security is going to be by the time I would be able to, to do much with it. But so I'm totally on my own in terms of a lot of that stuff.
Okay.
And I don't think I would recommend that to somebody going into ministry now. And I think he thought he was, doing the best he could. This was, again, around maybe the year 2000, late 90s or something like that. So, Yeah, I used to hear that a lot more often, that was what people were counseled to do. I don't hear that anymore. And most of our new ministers at our church have not opted out of Social Security. So
have you thought about opting back in?
Yeah, and I don't even, again, it's like I don't even understand all that. You know, I'm a adjunct professor at Abilene Christian, so like I've done some other jobs where I probably could get enough quarters together to get the minimum of Social Security, which is what my dad did over his career. You know, he ended up kind of piecing together enough to have the lowest level of Social Security stuff. So yeah, I've given that some thought for sure.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah. I mean, Jarrod, that's in keeping with some of the things we've talked about with a few other people, as that council has changed. But part of why that council has changed is that the IRS finally got a little bit more explicit with their instructions.
The wording.
So the wording changed. It didn't necessarily change, but it got more clear, and it became a little bit more easy for ministers to go, wait a second, I'm not actually opting out of that. So that's helpful. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the advice that a lot of ministers have had. And that's what drives this DIY, do it yourself kind of thing. Well, you think you can do better on your own.
But it's also, you know, as somebody who's a senior minister at a church where I'm seeing the other side of it, it's costing the church more money too, because we're having to pay in the half of it or whatever that we have to pay in. So, you know, I'm guessing it wasn't just ministers pushing other ministers to look out for themselves or something. I feel like there had to have been some institutional pressure,
definitely,
to opt out so that it was cheaper for churches too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I know that's why a lot of churches treat ministers as independent contractors, right? It's cheaper. And here in Oregon, we're actually going to be facing that a little bit with health insurance. So as very soon, I don't know that other states are following suit, but I'm sure California is in here as well, that no matter the size of your organization, you're no longer going to be allowed to just plead the fifth on providing health insurance. And so that's going away in the next few years. I think it's 2020. I think it's actually this year is kind of the last of the exemption, although I don't know, the pandemic may have slowed, but it was supposed to be 2022 or 2023 phase in. You couldn't, you know, even organizations below like 5 employees had to still do something. And obviously the government Obamacare type stuff is in play, but yeah, that's something to think about too. That the institutional pressure, I hadn't thought about that as being part of it.
There was an elder.
Jordan, I hadn't ever thought about IULs either until you had that call with me. And since then, I've actually gotten to meet some people and talk about it a little bit more. And it's fascinating. It's really an interesting thing. But one of the guys who's a big proponent of this thing calls it being your own banker.
Right.
And Nelson Nash, I think is his name. But if you dig deep enough, it's really, you can't get the support structure in place to make the thing work for 20 years. So you have to invest in this idea for 20 years for it to really become
a long-term vehicle. Yeah.
It's a long-term vehicle. And I think that's where, you know, like my wife saw the book on my table. It was like Mapping the Millionaire Mystery or something. And I said to her, don't worry, I'm not buying into some crap, you know. But I do think it's even advertised a little bit sneakily that way. And so, you know, if you dig into it, the people who are committed and it's working for them, they're not trying to sell you on a quick, rich scheme. No. They're in it for the long haul. And that's why I do feel like it's a valid tool, but it's not one that you can just kind of do passively. Like you actually kind of have to go all in. And that's my only residence is like, can I actually go all in? And, you know, I have some short-term debts that I have to pay off before I would be able to invest enough to get the banking going. And that's where some of the things, keeping interest payments to yourself, absorbing some of those things into your plans, are really enticing to me. Like, I love the idea of keeping the interest payments in my family so that there's some generational wealth to be passed on, which the death benefit helps. We're not in it for the death benefit when you're talking about IULs and some of these whole life policies. Typically speaking, the death benefit is a added bonus,
right?
But it's something that requires kind of getting all in, and that's sometimes a high bar.
Yeah, it can feel that, definitely feel that way. Some of the criticisms from Ramsey in the Wall Street Journal, because it's what's really funny that I found as I was writing this, is like Ramsey like despises IULs. If you go, you can't find it in any of his books. I don't really like Ramsey books. They're just a bunch of fluff and stories. Not much content. But when you read what he writes on his blog and on his website, he really kind of bashes IULs, and he says, interestingly, the same thing that the Wall Street Journal does as well about IULs. And here's some of their criticisms. They say that they criticize the complexity of these vehicles, leading to a lack of understanding for policyholders and misleading with overly rosy illustrations with high rates of return that lead to unrealistic expectations due to a lack of industry-wide standards on what you can use as an illustration. There's been a big fight over the past 10 years about illustrations in IULs. And a high cost of insurance that eats away at the cash value and can rise as a policyholder ages. Doug Andrew has responses to all of these, but these are some of the main criticisms. Others criticisms include a lack of guarantees for return, as caps and participation rates may vary year to year and prevent policyholders from fully benefiting from market rallies. Several times it has been mentioned how insurers routinely exclude reinvested dividends from stocks when calculating how much interest they pay to policyholders. And an oft-repeated criticism is that agents are selfish and amateur and act without fiduciary responsibility. They're just trying to sell these IULs because it's a big payday for them. There's also the danger
of a recurring payday.
Oh yeah, and a recurring payment. Payday. Yes, exactly. It's not just a one-time deal. And another criticism is there's also the danger of paying income taxes on withdrawals and loans and the remaining cash value if the policy lapses. And if the policy lapses, you got to pay taxes on all that money that's in there. If you're not able to continue the long haul of this. And again, it's a long-term vehicle, and that's a legitimate concern. Like, if you want to cancel this, it's going to cost you taxes wise. So those are a few of the criticisms. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that as you were listening.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Aaron.
Well, I mean, the caps are definitely an interesting point. Because if you have a big rally, other investment vehicles probably don't have the cap, but the downside of the other investment vehicles is they don't have a floor, whereas the IUL has a floor.
Yeah.
And so it won't ever go below 0% interest. It'll just stop gaining money. But it definitely has its criticisms, and from doing the illustrations, as confusing as they were to me,
right,
as many times they'd been explained, there were definitely times where when you're doing an illustration, you're sitting there going, is this legitimately like a reality that can actually come out of this?
Sure. Yeah.
Because it almost seemed unrealistic, while also seeing policies that were actually making it happen.
Right. Like, often, as you were training, they were training you to do these presentations. And they're going to say, is this too good to be true? And that's when you say, no, it's not, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I hate this. It's like, I don't want to give a presentation that's so corny and cliche. Please, let me do my own thing. But yeah, the illustrations did seem to kind of like that. Like, if it does do this, then shoot, why have I not heard about this before? And why do I not have 10 of them?
Right.
Yeah. Jarrod, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say, I think this is both more important and harder. It's a harder conversation than would have been even 10 years ago in terms of most of my ministry peers and how they're either feeling about ministry right now coming out of COVID, and or I think COVID in a lot of ways accelerated things by about 10 years in the course of 18 months in terms of a lot of the people you had that kind of had one foot out the door of church, streaming for however long. It just made it really easy to. I read an article somewhere that was talking about how, at any given point, you have people who are wondering if they want to keep doing certain things in their life. But because of COVID, the entire culture across the board is questioning, do I still want to do these things? Mm-hmm. And a lot of people's answer to, do I still want to go to church, was not so much. And so I think things feel really tentative. I think fragile. I think churches that prior to COVID had situations where their preachers felt pretty settled in and feeling like, okay, things are going to just kind of continue this way. So to ask a person who's thinking, am I still going to be at this church doing this job, making this money, or B, am I going to be in ministry at all? Or am I going to have to, and if I have to go any amount of time without an income, so to kind of say, you got to commit to this for a minimum of 20 years, no matter what's happening in your life.
Yeah.
I think that's a harder ask now for most ministers than it would have been certainly 10 years ago. But I'm saying prior to COVID, even that's a harder thing to say, go all in on a fixed premium that's higher than maybe you feel like you can do, unless all the stars align and everything stays that way for 20 years.
Right. Yeah. Life happens. Life has happened to me the past 5 years. And, but yeah, so I can imagine just some personal experience alone. It's tough to make it work. I do have one, and, but it's tough to make it work every month. Okay. And so let me read this to you now. This is Doug Andrews' 10 reasons why many people don't take advantage of an IOL from his perspective, from page 117. So here we go. The first 5 revolve around the financial professional in terms of why people don't take advantage of them. Perhaps the advisor has a lack of awareness, or maybe they avoid these products because of the extra effort, work, and responsibility it would take to help policyholders get and maintain them. It may be easier for professionals to offer traditional accounts rather than try to educate their clients on these products. Or perhaps it is simply a matter of money, as traditional accounts are more lucrative for them to sell than insurance policies. The second 5 revolve around people and their misperceptions. First, the regulatory climate that sets limits on how much money can go into life insurance helped create the common approach of buy term and invest the difference in traditional accounts. It is also common for people to believe the myth that life insurance is too expensive, that it is only for the wealthy, or that not many people have these policies due to a lack of awareness. The confusion created over the fact that insurance policies are not called investments also seems to scare people away as well. But those are what Andrew says. Here's 10 common reasons he's heard from people in terms of why they haven't perhaps taken advantage of IULs. And what would you say is like yours, if even if it's the first time you're hearing about it?
I guess my question, because I don't know anything, would be, okay, so I have roughly $100,000 in mutual funds and things. Yeah, I think I pay. So my church does a 3% match, up to 3% match of my salary. And I do, right now I'm doing $325 a paycheck, which is every 2 weeks. So what, for this year, that'll be 26 times or whatever. So they're going to match that up to, so that's what I'm doing right now. And we have other savings accounts and things like that. Right. But the question I would have, and this may not be part of this podcast, so you don't have to tell me, but it's like,
bring it.
Is what do I do with that? So if I decided this is a great idea, am I gonna be doing that in addition to that other stuff and leave that alone?
Right.
Would I take any of that money and put it into something like this? Like, how, I don't know.
Right.
I wouldn't know where to begin with all
Right. That would kind of be you and your financial advisor working that out in terms of, can you do this on
Okay.
top of what you're already doing, or can we shift some of this around? It all depends upon your situation, what you make work. Yeah.
Okay.
Aaron, what do you think? Which one of those 10 sounded similar or relevant to you?
So some of it has to do with the cost of insurance reality, because if you can't fund it enough to where the interest is overcoming the cost of insurance as you get older, it gets a little. And the only reason I know that side is because of my insurance training, which is minimal. And I didn't spend enough time doing it, but it was just enough to go, ooh, that could be really scary.
Yeah.
Because as you get older, the cost of insurance becomes increasingly more. And if you don't have a big enough chunk of change there, that cost of insurance offsets and begins decreasing the monetary value as well as the death benefit at a certain point. It begins decreasing all that and eating that away. And so then your investment becomes just paying for the cost of the insurance, and if you can't fund it well enough or continue funding it well enough, and
It lapses.
some of that stuff, then it lapses, and you can press pause on it for a little bit at times, and there's things like that. I mean, it's almost so complicated that even knowing what I know about it, it makes it a little scary. So I mean, that complication factor, I guess.
No, I mean, for me, again, it was very complicated and very hard to explain. Still after training and after writing about it, I was just making this comment recently today. It's like, I wish I lived like 200 years ago. So all I had to do was like my vocation and have 20 kids and they can take care of me till I die. It's like, I don't want any of these complicated retirement vehicles to have to worry about them. That's, I don't know. It's just my mentality.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Jarrod, you're asking the question that I've been asking, because I've been thinking about, well, how do I do the interest thing? How do I keep the interest in my family if I'm trying to avoid interest? Do I take some of the things I'm putting over in these other things and put it to that? And I don't want to sound too Ramsey-esque, but I would say, if you're getting a match, that's free money on the table. You better be taking that. And typically you can't.
I mean, we are
match.
Yeah.
But that's what I usually am saying anecdotally. Like, talk to a financial professional, your financial advisor or whatever. But you should be, if it's a 5% or 3% match, then you should be putting at least that much into the traditional vehicle. And then the Social Security thing, like, I think we've talked a little bit about it today. That is viable, and that's something the government is doing, and we should be pursuing that like it's going to be there. And then we should also be pursuing, we had a conversation in one of the previous episodes where it talked about how the minister's housing allowance reduces your AGI, which allows often a lot of ministers with a family to qualify for Obamacare or the state version, and in the marketplace. And so if your church is providing health insurance, sometimes that health insurance is not actually as good as what you could qualify for in the marketplace.
That's for sure the situation I'm in. As you might guess, most people who live in Abilene, Texas are not pro Obamacare marketplace. And so when you've got members who are the person we do insurance through, and members who are our financial advice, so you don't, that's the other thing about all this, is it's not just a question of what would the best, most effective, cost-effective way, there's personalities involved in churches that can make that a more challenging decision-making process too.
Wow. So I had a friend who was really wealthy and lived in South Carolina, I think it was, and they, we met them living overseas in Southeast Asia. So they were working, I don't know if they were working for an oil company, but some large business. And she said that when they lived in the little town, they went to the church that town had, and, basically in their denomination and stuff. And it was like, you knew everybody. And so for them, they had to drive. They drove at least an hour to another larger town to deal with banking and financial planning and, some of these things. And they did all of their banking in this other town. And I thought, you must be making a lot of money for that to have been an issue. But for them, I think there was a true practice that sometimes we need to be going outside of our churches. And so that's, somewhat what this space offers, right? Is that as you hear stories from ministers around the country, you get a lay of the land a little bit different. We get to not just assume that we all know what we're talking about. And there are resources available to us in other churches. In the Northwest, I was just visiting with a couple of the ministers. There's somebody, a member of the church, that does the bookkeeping and does all the taxes, not bookkeeping, does all the ministers' taxes as a service for them. And so she stays up to date on all the tax codes and all the things, and it's a great service. But she goes to, one of the churches, and these ministers are at all these other different churches. And so your church may not be the place that has all the experts. And I know that, was an experience at my church where we ended up being $100,000 in debt because we were relying on somebody who was an accountant to do our payroll, but he didn't know church codes and taxes, and he did it wrong. Mm-hmm. And, 10, 15 years later, the IRS finally did come knocking, and it was a big bill. And so, yeah, I think that there's something to what you're saying. Like, personalities aside, we should be able to look outside our churches for expertise elsewhere.
Yeah. One funny thing that I found is, and this was even mentioned in my training back in 2020, was that like University of Michigan paid Jim Harbaugh with an IUL. He's going to be set for life as a result of this deal he made as one of the most well-paid college football coaches in history. It was as one ESPN article said, it was the most talked about life insurance story in years about Jim Harbaugh as the head football coach in the University of Michigan. The interim athletic director, Steve Hackett, who was also on the board of Northwestern Mutual, interesting, made Harbaugh the highest paid coach in college football in 2016. Hackett and Michigan created a deferred compensation package utilizing cash value life insurance or an index universal life policy. Hackett took a commonly used tool in the business community to retain and reward his top coach, which is what businesses often do to retain top talent in their particular business. Many schools have followed suit with similar compensation packages for their coaches. So what they did was Harbaugh and Michigan entered a split loan agreement, meaning the premium, cash value, and death benefit is split between these two parties. This policy was funded by a cash value life insurance or an index universal life policy. The university agreed to pay $7 $2 million loan advances into the policy, which they will totally recoup upon Harbaugh's passing through the death benefit. That something could be as high as $75 million. Harbaugh's beneficiaries will receive the rest. Harbaugh can borrow out of the policy tax-free now, which is living benefits, which is said to be an advantage of IUL. He can borrow out of the policy tax-free now, and is projected that he could begin taking out $1.4 million tax-free beginning at the age of 66. So he's set for life, And so like I was thinking, like, as I was learning about this and reading about that, and like maybe churches could be the ones offering their ministers this for them, paying into it to where the amount that they would put in every year, they could be set. And they didn't have to be something they would have to worry about. But that then also requires that minister to be there a long time as well, which we know in Church of Christ is not always the case, more times than not. I don't know. Thoughts on Jim Harbaugh? Talk some football with two Texas guys.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I think that's the big question. Go ahead, Aaron. Go ahead.
I just think it's interesting that they put themselves as one of the death beneficiaries to take the $2 million that they paid into it to basically set up that interest
or to gain a lot of money really quick.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so that's gaining interest, and then they're going to get their money back and still have a death benefit for the kids. Like it, yeah. Well, and interestingly, as you talk about that, I mean, I think about my experience with churches. This is kind of bouncing kind of back into that, but my experience with churches. So when I was at the first church I was at, they were matching some of my income, and I started a 403b, and then we had a shortfall or whatever, and so everybody had to take a cut, and I didn't. My wife was in nursing school at the time, and I didn't have the money to take a pay cut, so I took it in benefits. So I just stopped them paying into my 403b, and I stopped paying into my well, no, I still paid into it for 3 years. But then when I went to the next church, they only paid a percentage at the end of the year, which was just a chunk. And then they took taxes out of that. And that was meant to be for my retirement. But by that point, we had 2 kids, and we had bought a house, and I had cashed out my 403b so that we could buy a house as a down payment. Dumb idea, but whatever, it was what it was. But we were trying to get out of an apartment with kids and trying to do something with what we were doing. And then my wife's retirement has always matched 6%, which has been really cool, being a nurse. And so I don't know what's in her account, but she's got it builds pretty well. But so I didn't really have anything at the second church per se. And then when I was preaching, it was all up to me. And by that point, when we moved from Fresno, we had a house that we were trying to sell, and we were paying rent and all sorts of different things. And so we ate through our savings, and I had to cash out what else I had. And then finally we're able to buy a house there, and which is now a rental house, which is kind of what we're hoping will turn into, some retirement at some point, so to speak. And while my wife is building her retirement on her end, ours is kind of becoming that. But I didn't really have that benefit at any of the churches per se. And so it wasn't a good option. And with moving and changing jobs and those sorts of things, it just ate through everything that we had in 2 different situations. And so it just ended up, it's having something where they had started something where I could press pause until I get another job, and then be able to start firing back onto that. But man, when you're digging out of a hole, it's hard to do,
Yeah.
So.
No, thanks for sharing that. Jarrod, what did you want to say?
Well, I preached at 3 churches. The first church gave me a salary and a parsonage, which in California was important, but it meant I wasn't getting anything, which was, I think, a big piece of why we were open to moving. Was it just felt like this isn't working. The church can't afford to pay me enough to put me in a normal house of my own and build equity, and they couldn't afford to. It wasn't like it wasn't a game. They couldn't afford to. So when I moved to Dallas, no retirement stuff, but they did immediately give my wife and I can't even remember, I'm just going to ballpark it, like $25,000-$30,000 down payment for a house, like as a signing bonus kind of thing.
That's awesome.
Which, so got us into a house in Dallas. So, we were able to sell that house. We moved to Abilene, turn around and put most of that money back into the house we bought here. So, I just wanted to say, I think there are different ways in terms of, until I got to Southern Hills, I didn't have any church that was saying, we're going to do a retirement, match. And this is, and we're going to help you kind of have someone if you want to use them. I haven't been forced to use a financial advisor from church, but I just have used somebody from church that, I trust and have a good relationship with. But I do feel like, considering the fact that I've been at 3 churches and only one of them was offering that, you do wonder how rare relatively that is for a lot of ministers, that's right. Just never even a discussion. You're on your own.
It's a DIY denomination in many ways, and especially with retirement. Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. And let's move on. I know in question 2, I wanted to ask what retirement vehicles you're currently utilizing and ballpark how much you have saved. I know, Jarrod, you already kind of mentioned some of that. So put question 2 and 3 together, like what would you say that your level of retirement anxiety is? Because Teresa Ghilarducci says the new class divide is one's level of retirement anxiety within this DIY retirement crisis. So, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most, like how would you rate your retirement anxiety within this, what she calls the DIY retirement crisis?
Well, because I don't know a lot about retirement, my anxiety, I would say, is pretty high. Both because I've watched my dad basically have to get creative with, he didn't feel like he could do preaching anymore. So now, and he loves what he's doing, but it's like, is he going to do that till he's 95? I mean, so it's just been kind of an eye-opening thing to watch my dad have to try to navigate that and think, okay, I don't, on one hand, and you referenced it in the chapter, I'm guessing you talk about it more throughout the project, but it's like, I'm not super interested in the perpetual vacation model.
No. Yeah.
I'm not. So, I'd be real anxious if I thought that's what I was going for.
Yeah.
If there's the question of if I'm going to be able to do enough, my wife has not worked since we had children. And will eventually get into the workforce. And our hope is that we can take virtually everything she makes and start just dumping that into retirement stuff. Right. So I kind of feel like I'm in this weird spot at 44. I have a 14-year-old and 11-year-old, 2 daughters. I feel like I'm in a weird spot where I know what I should be doing. I don't feel like I have the income to really do some of the things I really feel like I should be doing. But I also see options for my family to kind of figure out how can we try to make up, knowing that it's closer to the end than it should have been. We're not 25. How could we, start to really direct as much as possible, which is where this chapter was really interesting to me. I'd never heard of it, didn't know anything about it. I don't think I have a way to do it in the next year or something, but I feel like I could possibly be able to explore something like that when my wife starts working and we've got a different level of income.
Yeah. No, that's good stuff. Thanks for sharing. Aaron, how would you rate your level of retirement anxiety right now?
Retirement?
Yes, the 30-year vacation in Palm Springs. Are you almost there?
That sounds awful.
I know.
Which is funny because I remember early on in our marriage, Sarah asked me, how, like what I was looking forward to in retirement. Nice. And I said, I don't want to retire. I can't stand sitting around the house as it is, like, let alone thinking about doing it for years on end. And I've seen so many people break down, and that's just kind of my personal bend. Yeah. But that being said, I also know I'm probably now being in roofing, even though I make better money than I ever did in ministry.
Wow.
Maybe I should see myself. A little different in California. Y'all don't have that, although y'all have had some hail. That's been different. But it's I can't see myself jumping on roofs in 20 years.
Right.
I'll be almost 60, and I don't know that I want to be running around on people's roofs in 20 years. Running a roofing company, maybe, but I don't want to be doing it.
Yeah.
And so that being said, like there's a what do I wish could be different, or what's my level of anxiety?
Yeah.
I don't know. I like want to hit something hard and die before I have to retire. I don't know. I'm kind of a weird duck. Like, I don't want to live to 95. I just
Okay.
don't want to decay.
All right. You
But
want to go die young.
I'm
Okay.
probably weird like that. Yeah. Well, not young, but young enough.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm aware of it. I'm conscious of it. I mean, my goal this year is to pay off as much debt as I can that we've incurred over the past couple of years. My transition out of preaching and level into here was rough.
Okay.
I was doing hospice chaplain stuff for a little bit and not making anything.
Right.
And I loved it. But I wasn't making enough money, and that was creating anxiety. And I was making, I mean, I had the potential to make good money doing roofing stuff, but I was splitting time and I was just torn. And, I really wanted to get back into full-time ministry. And then, it's so I'm anxious about it, but I'm also, I don't know. I don't worry about the future a lot.
Okay.
That's kind of I'm a millennial, so I guess that puts me in that category.
I'm rubbing it in.
Yeah.
I didn't give you a number, right? Are you saying 10 is like a panic attack and 1 is I'm fine? I shouldn't joke about that. I would say probably a 6,
Okay.
5 or 6. And it didn't get better reading your chapter. So I'll say that.
Sorry.
No. I just mean, I think part of it, as Aaron was talking about, I think a lot of guys just don't want to think about it.
Yeah.
They don't, they know it's not great, and they know it's, they're not going to be, excuse me, on the beach somewhere forever. And so it's like you just put your head down and work. And I especially think ministers can have a theology that causes them to think, well, God's just going to take care of me, which is a really, I think, especially if you have a wife and children or a spouse and children, that is not a good way to approach any of this. Right. But I think you're kind of in a field where people can just act like, well, I've given my life to God and I've done all this work and God's going to take care of me, which causes, a lack of financial planning for retirement.
Yeah, I was
there.
Go ahead.
I remember a guy one time. We were a buddy of mine. We were at a conference, and I remember him talking. We were amazed at how smooth his transitions and PowerPoint stuff was, and he talked a little bit about that, and he said, a lot of people think the Holy Spirit only works in this instantaneous moment, but he goes, why in the world do we not believe that the Holy Spirit works through our preparation? And I think that plays out in a lot of different ways in our lives. Like, why do we expect God only to provide in the moment when he's been providing all along, and we're not planning for the opportunity that he's giving us to be able to serve without having to, to serve and live without having to worry and rely on everybody else in that, which is not just a DIY thing, but it's also, I think, a wise planning thing that we should do,
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the next question. And Jarrod, you had referenced this, like, okay, in the paper, like one of the sections in the introduction is, all right, how this idea of retirement, what are we working with here? What's our definition? And yes, we kind of, the 30-year withdrawal vacation, that's cliche. All right, let's not get bogged down on that. Okay, you might have a negative perception of retirement, especially as a Christian, and it might be because of that, but that's not really what retirement is. And there's an author that describes and defines retirement as the third age, where it, in a very different way, but perhaps in a more fulfilling way. But how can you honor, glorify God within this last what she calls last third of life. Let's define retirement like this, and just not get bogged down with that negative perception of 30-year withdrawal vacation. So, and that's one of the assumptions I make. Okay, moving forward in this paper, let's get away from the cliche. All right, let's not let that negatively impact us in terms of how we think and prepare for retirement. But the fourth question is, tell your story from the angle of retirement savings and being a pastor in Churches of Christ. What can you share that you haven't already shared in terms of telling your story from that angle?
Aaron?
I mean, one of the things I love about Churches of Christ, and one of the things that really frustrate me about Churches of Christ, is the autonomy part of it.
Yeah.
That there's little to no unifying markers between it. So even if one church provides a retirement benefit, you go to the next church and they're we don't do that. Okay, well, but I need you to do that. I need that help. I need that benefit. I need, I mean, so the autonomy in Churches of Christ is beautiful in one sense and is really frustrating in other senses, or in other cases where, and specifically in this being a pastor, where you go from one church to the next and you just kind of hope and pray that something changes, and like, Jarrod, your wife's not been able to not work. For us, I didn't make enough money for her not to work. I mean, we needed her to work, and for a couple of reasons. Number one, she had health insurance. And we had health insurance at the second church that I worked at, but then later I ended up moving over to hers, and they ended up paying what they were paying towards
like
that
a stipend. Yeah.
But the last church I worked at where I was preaching, they were like, I was like, well, I really need this because we don't know how long it's going to take for her to get her Texas nursing license, and when she's going to find a job. And so I really need you to pay me this amount because this is what insurance is going to cost us. And they go, well, we were really hoping she was going to work so that she could provide insurance for y'all. And I was like, oh. I mean, that's just health insurance, right? Let alone any sort of retirement that goes along with that. And so the autonomy factor within Churches of Christ is, I think, one of the most frustrating, and that plays into how churches are led and the polity of it that you talked about. The way that all that works is just man, it can be really, really difficult to navigate through.
Sure can. Jarrod, what do you think, man?
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the things that's hard in general about this conversation in the context of the Churches of Christ, because not only is the autonomy thing very difficult in terms of national approaches or international approaches to anything, or pooling of best practices, or you've also got issues of different geographical, political contexts where I've worked in churches where everybody there kind of worked with their hands. And their assumption is ministers don't work hard because they work with their minds.
Right.
And I've worked in contexts where everyone's an office professional, where nobody works really with their hands. They all do kind of, that kind of intellectual type of work. They don't have the same kind of attitude about ministers don't work that hard, so they shouldn't be paid that much. But you don't know those things if you find out you got to move, or you may not have choices to say, well, I'm going to choose to always work in a white collar community so that people don't question whether or not I work hard. Right. And I would guess that in a lot of those rural communities, it's very, very difficult for a minister to say, well, I would like things provided for me that they feel like go with kind of more of a white collar type job approach, which is tricky because, I think in the not too distant past, a lot of people who worked labor intensive jobs had pensions,
right,
and things like that. But that's getting more and more complicated. And I don't think that's as true as it used to be.
It's not.
And so, there's church members that think the preacher shouldn't make any more than the least wealthy person at church. I've heard that a number of times from people. It's like you should make a little less than the poorest person at church. Now, I've never had anyone tell me that, but I've heard people, talk like that. So I think you've got the issue of not only do you have different approaches to things, but you just got very different expectations of how we're going to provide for a minister.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say, just in terms of my own experience, is on one hand, it is a lack of communication. It would be super helpful, if churches could say, because I think one of the key issues for my congregation or my size church staff, right, which is like 10 ministers and, a aging, humongous property that we're dealing with, that, health insurance, the cost of health insurance to the church is a very high cost, and it's pretty limited in terms of how good it is for me. Because we're in a small pool. We have some people with chronic illnesses. And so, I'm getting not very good insurance in terms of bang for buck. Now, I say that they pay 100% of my health insurance, but none for my family. So, you're kind of, in some churches, I've had churches where they paid half of everything. They paid half of my, my, whatever you call it, premium, and half of my family's or whatever. So the other piece of all this is I don't know how you would even go about, other than offering, here's best practices and this is effective. It's not like you can tell elderships and churches. I mean, the quickest way to get them not to do something would be to tell them what they have to do. They're just not, that's not going to go well for most elderships. So the other thing I would just say is, for the most part, I have been on my own. I have been well taken care of, especially in the last two churches I've ministered with. The salary number is generous, but and like with the church I'm at now, I've got the 3% match, but I'm kind of on my own in terms of what to do with any of that. And my wife has some accounting training, but that's not the same thing as financial planning or investing or any of that. Right. And so basically, I'll just say the only help I've ever had with any of that has been other ministers who run into something good and they try to share it with me. But really, it's been my in-laws and my own parents. That's been the primary people in my life who've talked to me ever about what are we doing for retirement. Right. So when I think about resources that I wish we had, is even if churches weren't going to all share something, is there a way to create some sort of, compiling of here's some things you need, here's some basics, and here's some things you need to be looking at, knowing that you may not be able to afford to do it all the time or whatever, but if you can, here's some ways to not hurt, burn yourself later, just because you don't know.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. I wish I would have had something like that as well. And it doesn't, and I don't think there actually is a resource out there for like general ministers. If you're a minister pastor, read this book, and there really isn't, that at least that I've found. And it's kind of like, why isn't there that,
yeah, or at least the website. I mean, I know you'd have to update it. There's always small changes to the laws and things like that, but yeah, you're pretty much, you almost have to find some financial person and then get the courage to say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. Can you tell me a little bit about retirement or whatever?
Yeah. I mean,
so one of my friends who's works, or one of my colleagues who works in my office here at the university, she worked for the United Methodist General Council in California, and she said, one of the things they have to do every to get ministers certified in there, because during the conference, they have to actually make sure you're up to date on different things. And one of it is a class, so because we're such a DIY denomination and we don't have ordination requirements and we don't have, on and on it goes. There's no way for us to actually build financial education and ongoing financial education and retirement education and these things into it. And that's why I think our direction has often taken either one of two approaches in this podcast. One is, okay, if you got to play the DIY game, then get some help in doing that, but the other is the burden then could fall to churches. And that's why I do like the idea of imagining what would it look like, not for ministers to have to go after a complicated vehicle like an IUL, but what would it look like for a church to do this? And just like they're providing health insurance and all these other things as part of the benefit, because I don't think we can leave it up to, and this is maybe where I play my hand a little bit on sin and, image of God, but I believe a little bit in the depravity of people. Like, left to my own devices, I'm gonna kind of choose not to think long term. And unless I do a lot of reflection and unless I have some really good trusted people around me, I'm likely to kind of pursue the short term and not take in the long term and not keep that in mind. And so I just think that's a benefit a church could offer a minister, is to say, we're going to think about this for you. And then, as Jordan hinted at already, like, could this be part of the contract? And I think other denominations do this better than we do. But nowhere did I sign I'm going to be at this church, I'm committing or coveting to this church that I'm going to be there for 4 years. And obviously, at will employment and all those things have to come into play. But I think churches should be inviting their ministers to consider making and coveting to a longer term commitment. And at least I don't encounter this very often, and you guys maybe have more experience than I do with churches that do that kind of a contract basis. But the 3 churches that I've worked at, nowhere did we even have a conversation about, hey, how long are you going to be here? In fact, it was more often an assumption that I was going to be gone in the next 2 years.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say, I probably reached a place with both churches that I've been at for 8 years, which this church now is getting nervous because I left my last church at 8 years. I think, 3 years in, maybe 4 years in, you could probably get, for the most part, I feel like elders want an out. They're not so worried about you promising for a long-term commitment. It's more, they're not sure what they have, and they wouldn't want anything that backed them into a corner where, and it's not that hard to write a morals clause into a contract or something, but which is what they're worried about. It's that, I would guess, more than anything else. But it's like, I do think thinking through how a church, you would definitely have to have some relationship with that congregation that's established enough that they would be willing to say, we'd like you to be our minister for the foreseeable future. Can we enter into some longer term structured kind of payment? Like I said, though, I think that's increasingly difficult in the current climate, where a lot of churches are not sure how they're doing financially or going to be doing in the long term. And it might be hard to get them to agree to anything that would be structured out. But I wouldn't want to not try just because of that question, but I think it would be a real challenge.
I remember when my grandmother was in the hospital, she attended a Methodist church, and I remember visiting with her pastor for a while she was in the hospital, and just kind of talking to him about the structure and the way that worked. And I said, well, how do you get raises? Because even that is questionable at a lot of churches. Like, I have no idea if I'm going to get a cost of living increase or a raise, right, or whatever. My last church was really generous for the size that it was. It was and when I got my master's, they gave me a raise and gave me a yearly raise on top of that, and different things for the most part. But it was always a question. And then there's the backside of that is, how do I ask for that? How do I ask for those things? Because there's this other reality of, well, we're doing what we do because it's what everybody should do. And we just happen to be getting paid to be the professional Christian, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so how do I ask for a raise because of whatever's going on, or just because I haven't gotten one in 5 years or whatever, let alone fringe benefits, or what we call fringe benefits, but what shouldn't be fringe benefits. And then and what he was saying was that your retirement was covered by the Methodist denomination. And then the other part that Lars was talking about is their contract. So even if they were at a church and it wasn't going well after 2 years, they would put them in another church, and they automatically had another church that they could go to, and their pay didn't stop unless something moral came up. And so the centrality of that totally changed. I was like, man, I could become Methodist just to do ministry, you know?
Go ahead. Oh, I was going to say,
No,
I visited Southern Baptist Theological Seminary to see if I wanted to go there for an MDiv with a friend of mine from Freed-Hardeman, and they said, if you become Southern Baptist here today, we'll pay for all of your tuition. I'm like, let me think about that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the centralization. Teresa Gorducci mentioned a study about like which denomination has the best pension program, retirement system, and it's the more centralized denominations, the older ones from back yonder in Europe, like Episcopalians and such. They're doing the best, and us.
It's a great Texas word, Jarrod.
What's that? Which one?
Yonder.
Yonder. Oh, yonder. Yeah. But yeah, us more of like a newer American denominations are less so. But let's move on to question 5, guys. And let me ask you this. Do you think being in Church of Christ has hurt or helped your asset accumulation for retirement?
As opposed to another church group or something?
Not so much as opposed.
I mean, the answer is yes, no matter what. I'll just say yes.
Okay.
Just because there was no focus, no training, no centralized, I definitely feel like I'm at a disadvantage compared to peers that I have that are in different industries.
Yeah.
I feel like they understand their retirement stuff better. It's kind of a given that this is part of the package. So I feel like I'm way behind the curve in terms of that. Because I'm a minister and specifically in the Churches of Christ.
I feel the same way. And before you answer it, I don't know if you read any other portion of the paper where I go into Lisa Keister's study, Conservative Protestants and Wealth, where she's like, conservative Protestants, which Churches of Christ are lumped into, she's like, they're not doing well on retirement for multiplicity of reasons, but particularly because of the way you think about retirement theologically. It's not important. It's not important to save for retirement. And there's other sociological factors that lead into that. But she's like, if you stay in these conservative environment arenas and conservative Protestant environments long enough, like not only as a kid, but also for your entire life, your asset accumulation is going to be way more down than if you say we're born in it and you get out of that conservative Protestant environment. But her conclusion is conservative Protestants need to start saving for retirement the way other groups do if they want to increase their retirement wealth accumulation. But and so from that study, it seemed like, if you're a conservative Protestant like Church of Christ, it does kind of hurt you, especially, let's say, if you're in a family where serving in ministry is part of that legacy, multi-generational legacy. It seems like it really hurts. My dad's dad was a minister. So my dad was a PK, and then I became a minister. And so in my experience, and at least in light of Keister's study, it's really kind of seems to be that way. Aaron, go ahead and answer.
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. It's kind of weird, the all the tax stuff with ministry, because I didn't opt out of Social Security. So my taxes at the end of the year, when the first year that my wife started working, and then I had to do taxes, like I owed like $6,000, which it's still a lot, but at the time it was like, what?
Yeah.
Because then I had to pay you then have to pay the 13% on the housing allowance at the end of the year if you didn't set enough aside throughout the year.
Right.
Well, now what's even crazier is now, as a roofer, a roofing contractor, I'm an independent contractor, so I'm a 1099. Everything I do is commission based, and nothing gets taken out. So I have to set it aside. I have to pay quarterlies. There's nobody paying into anything except for me. And so even the lack of having been in biblical education and having no training whatsoever in that, and no help when I got into my professional career as a minister, it definitely, like, I look at just my wife as an example. Like I said, she walked into it and they said, we matched 6%. And I said, you're going to do that from the very get-go. We don't want to see that money. Like, if we ever see it, we won't give it back. Like, just don't let it come home. And so, and that's kind of that, lack of worry, and probably unhealthily so. But on the same side, there was no education. There's no help. There's no encouragement to look for that, because you could be preaching from a stool or from a wheelchair till the day you die, is kind of the way they talk about it. And I'm going, but is that really what you want? I mean, is that really what you want from me as your minister? No matter how much you love me or don't love me, at some point I'm not going to be useful to you anymore. And then what? And then do we become that, the pastor emeritus, down the road, where they're just trying to help me survive because I didn't have any way to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So moving to question 6, guys, what do you feel, and we've already probably touched on a lot of this, let's focus on this. What do you feel are the challenges to safer retirement as a pastor in Church of Christ, and also what benefits are there, if any? So challenges, benefits, we've mentioned a lot of challenges, but what stands out most to you in terms of a biggest challenge?
I would just keep repeating lack of any real training at all. Obviously, not having money for it would be a huge issue, but if you don't know what to do with the money, even if you have it, and I just had, I went to ACU. I have a undergraduate MDiv. I have a Doctor of Ministry I completed at Lipscomb. Nowhere in any of that did anybody give me a 2-hour presentation on retirement.
I know. Same here, man. Same here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would think that some sort of, like, all of our schools, all of these schools have a finance department of some sort. Like, have them come in and talk to these men and women who are going into ministry in the who understand the church culture that we're going into, and saying, hey, they're not going to help you with this. You need to know at least a few things. Or at least, here's 3 books, read them, please, because you're going to need to know this stuff. Because there's not going to be anybody that's going to come alongside you and say, hey, so what are you doing about that? And let me help you take a look at your finances. And because the other part is, as a minister, it's really awkward having financial conversations with people in your church where, because everybody's salary is all lumped into administrative, whatever. And so, because we don't talk about that. And so then they go, well, you're getting paid this, and these are all your bills. And, it was always awkward even having those conversations, where you go, but I need somebody to help me look at this because I know that that's important, but I don't know what to do with it. And I don't know who to go to.
Yeah.
And I don't have the money to pay somebody to help me with it. So now what,
I know. That's like the first thing all these books say is like, get a financial advisor. Well, I got to pay that person and I can't pay that person. Yeah. Okay. And so let's talk greatest benefit. Like, what do you think is the best benefit of being a pastor in Church of Christ in terms of saving for retirement, if there is one? Well, how would you answer that?
I mean, the only answer I can give is my current church, offered a 3% match and encouraged me to do it. So in my entire career, I would say that's the primary, net positive when it comes to retirement.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Aaron, what do you think, man?
I don't know that there is one,
Okay.
unless you have Jarrod's situation. I mean,
Yeah.
like I said, I was blessed with that at the first one, but then we had to make cuts. I couldn't afford to take a pay cut.
Yes.
So I had to take it in benefits. So I ate my health insurance and I ate,
Ouch.
my retirement benefit. That was all I could do.
Yeah.
And so I don't know that there is one.
Yeah. Okay. No, so
and I'm not a pessimist. I'm an optimist.
No,
Like
you
the
are.
glass is always half full,
Yeah.
and I just don't know that there is one.
Okay. No, it's a fair answer. It's an honest answer.
Yeah. The way I've articulated it a couple times to people is that the side of the coin of the DIY nature is the benefit. In many ways, we have not a whole lot of rules and regulations and things that tell us in Churches of Christ and tell our churches how to operate. And so that actually allows for some really unique freedoms and cool things. I also think that there's another side to the lack of resources, and that motivates us to go get the tent making stuff and do a little bit of that. And some of the co-vocational, bivocational ministry things that are out there, a lot of the missional church movements will actually say your church pastor should not be more than 3/4 time. Like if your pastor is 3/4 time or higher, then you're missing out because them being involved in some sort of other vocation is actually a really great way to engage their community and to be a pastor. And it also changes the church's imagination to not be so dependent on pastors and pastoral staff. And so, I think this is a lot of what we talk about in some of the other episodes on the Church of Christ or the Stone Campbell movement early controversies about located ministers. And it's one of the things that we'd like to get back to. I actually think could be really helpful. And so I look at it that way, as the benefit drives, it's maybe a bad benefit, but it drives me to a new imagination to get my benefits somewhere else, whether through a spouse income or job or through my own co-vocational interests. That's what I'm doing. I'm helping. My primary day job is at the university, but I'm preaching and speaking and serving the kingdom in new ways because I'm not located at one particular congregation.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question for you guys is, what have you found to be the greatest help in terms of saving for retirement as a pastor? I think we've touched on this already, but let's focus in on it here with question 7. What's the greatest help in saving for retirement?
I think conversations like this.
Yeah.
I mean, but making them more public. I mean, we need a more public conversation about retirement in ministry, as pastors, as people who are serving the church. And I like that, Lars. I mean, I've found that I have quite a bit of freedom in uh, being a roofer. I mean, the church here calls me the young adults minister. I don't have a lot of time with them because I have a family and I'm working full time, but I love those guys, those young adults, those college students, and I spend a lot of time with them. They're fun, and I love teaching them. I love hanging out with them. But I also have a lot of freedom in that, and being able to do a lot of different things that I couldn't do, um, because I'm also engaging the community, and so, um, I think that's an interesting perspective. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. All right. What do you think, Jarrod?
I mean, what I would say just in general is there have been some people at all of the churches I've worked at that care about ministers, that have some financial skill set, who, whether they didn't have to know everything about my income to say, hey, have you heard about this? Have you looked into this? And so I would say that's really been the greatest help in terms of just my experience. I'm not saying that's the limit of everyone's experience, but I've had financially gifted, skilled people at every church I've been at that they've at least tried. They've offered some help. But it is, as Lars said, that can sometimes feel weird too, to talk to only people in your own church. And so I probably should have done a better job, these kinds of conversations, or asking somebody, hey, what's a really good resource something I could listen to, something I could read. I think it's there, but I definitely haven't, taken full advantage of it.
Yeah, like Keiser's findings makes me think like, okay, if it's like a culture problem, then maybe I need to get outside of Church of Christ culture to learn how to save better, the way others are saving better. So yeah, it would, like, if I was still in full-time ministry, I might not want to. I would be very grateful for those within the culture and congregation for any help that they would want to provide. But I think I'd also seek an outside perspective as well if I was still in full-time ministry. I've been out since 2019. But yeah, this podcast, Aaron, is like, we keep saying it, we keep quoting Hamilton. We hope this is a room where it happens for many people, not just pastors and churches of Christ.
Yeah.
And so I definitely needed something like this for the last decade. And so hopefully this serves people well when all these episodes get published. Okay, so moving on to the next question. What do you feel, and this is theology-wise, what do you feel is theological or ethical ideal in terms of saving for a living or retirement? I don't know if you read chapter 3 or not, but how did you have like this conception of, yeah, this is like, in terms of money and saving, this is like, yeah, I'm working with this ideal, or did you not have anything at all, or what? How would you answer that question?
Well, I think for the most part, and this may be, I haven't looked carefully at chapter 3. I need to confess to you.
Fine. No,
this may be part of the sociological stuff you're talking about. I think, I think the Apostle Paul thinks that there's certain things that are personal, but nothing's private in the life of a disciple. So, sexuality, obviously personal, but it's not private. It's not off the table to discuss. And I feel like money's one of those things in the church cultures I grew up in, where you didn't have a right to tell me what to do with my money. And anytime, even now, when I preach on giving at church, I have someone say as they're walking out, angling for a raise, huh, preacher? Like, it's a sense that it's just kind of every man for himself. And don't you start meddling with what I do with my money. I work hard for it. I can do what I want with it, and you need to trust that I'm doing some helpful things with it for other people, because again, I think most churches talk about blessing other people through some form of financial margin that you have that, you hope you can help other people with. I don't know that I ever heard anyone talk about what would partnering in the present with God's financial care in your life, if you partnered with God in the present in a way that would help take care of your family in the present and future, and possibly allow you to bless other people in the future, what would that look like? I've never heard any conversation like that at church. Now, I think part of it is you have different definitions of retirement, and you definitely have people at church who want the 30-year vacation. They want that, and they don't want to be told that actually what a adequate amount of retirement wealth could allow you to do is volunteer your time for organizations that can't afford to pay you to do things that are meaningful to you in that last third of that third age of life. We don't talk about it primarily. I've rarely heard. I take that back. We have one elder at our church who has taught a class on enough, and he does 1 week where he talks about retirement, and he says, it doesn't matter how old you are, you're going to need a reason to get up in the morning, and it can't be to go out to the beach and hang out. Like, you're going to need, but that's the, and the, 25 years or whatever I've been preaching, and before that growing up in Churches of Christ, I never heard anyone talk about retirement as a part of your mission. And what would it look like if you had a missional view of your own retirement? I think if we could talk about it in that way, then it would feel less kind of icky to talk about wealth building if it was somehow attached to kingdom work. And one of the things that I think ministers need to think through is for their own children and other churches. If they get to a point where they're really old or they're sickly or whatever, and they can't minister anymore and they have no retirement, then who's going to pay for that? Someone's going to pay for that. Someone's going to have to. And I don't want to be living in a way right now that's forcing other people. I don't even know who I'm going to be asking for help from. That I'm comfortable doing that. So I do think theologically, I would rather pray for a bread factory than daily bread. I want it all at once, and I don't want to have to keep depending on God, right? So I think you can tip too far the other direction.
Sure.
But what would it mean to be a good steward of that daily bread? How do I set some aside? Because I expect to be around for a while. And I want to be free to do some things with my life that I'm not free to do now. In the primary wage earning time of my life. I'm going to be quiet now.
No, it's great. No, awesome thoughts, especially since you hadn't read chapter 3, where I try to go and approach retirement from the Nazareth Manifesto perspective and angle of Jesus and how he framed his ministry in Luke 4 based upon that, the Jubilee ethic, and approaching retirement from more of a communal mindset than an individualistic American mindset. Like, what can we do to help people out, especially if millions and millions of boomers and other members of future generations of Americans are going to reach retirement with not enough money to last all of retirement, and therefore be near poor or in poverty in retirement. This is a huge issue, especially since American retirement inequality is worse than just income inequality in our country. So, Aaron, how would you answer that question?
Man, the passage that comes to mind is the one about the storehouse, and you begin to think about what the storehouse was for in agricultural communities. There was a season of harvest, but that stuff was set aside for the future, for when they would need it in the future, because you can't use it all now. And even then you need to make sure that you're ready for winter that's coming. And I think that we have unhealthily talked about how God will provide for us, and I'm not saying that I don't believe that. Please don't hear me say that. I don't think you guys are, but um, but we are living beyond our capability to work. And by and large, our society is living longer and longer. And so how are we preparing for that time when we're unable to work? And if you want to tie that back to that passage or to that idea, is there is a season of harvest, and that is our working years. And then there is a time when harvest is not feasible because the weather's not right. The weather's not right. The ground's not ready. You're not getting rain. It's not rainy season. It's not plowing season. All those things. And so you have to prepare for what is coming. I mean, you even look in the Old Testament when, during the famine and where they would set stuff aside, and the people who didn't set stuff aside are having to lean on the people who were able to. And because of that, you have both a communal and a looking ahead mindset to prepare for what's coming. And because we know that's coming, I think we have a responsibility set forth by God to prepare for the coming famine, i.e., retirement, not working. And that's preparing both for ourselves and for the people around us that we're able to care for and provide for them in the coming season. And I think that we have done a poor job of applying those ideas to the way that we live now. I mean, contextualizing that reality that there is a time when harvest will be no more. And I'm preaching to myself right now that there's going to be a time when I'm not going to be able to work for whatever reason, or I'm not going to want to work. And so then how am I preparing to still be able to serve and care for others, whether that's my family or other people outside of that, and be able to provide in the same ways that I am now.
Right. And look, tomorrow. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. And I mean, you're a roofer. That could be tomorrow. You could fall,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then what? Right.
And then what? And for many people, it's sooner rather than later. It's sooner rather than later. But good thoughts, guys. We need to wrap up. So I want to ask this final question, and that's question 10. So what would you tell a new pastor or pastor in training about saving for retirement before they dive into full-time ministry? What would you tell them?
Well, start right away. But yeah, get your hands on some good information and make sure that you have some idea of the basics of, I had never heard of what's it called? UIL? I don't know.
IUL.
IUL, whatever. Anyway.
Yeah.
I have some idea of it, right? And it basically took reading a chapter in a project and talking about it with you guys, and I'm going to look more into it, right? So just knowing that some things are out there, it doesn't, I think the biggest piece of advice I'd give is any amount of putting this off because it makes you uncomfortable or you feel like you don't know what you're like is a complete waste of time.
Yeah.
You're not supposed to know when you first get into the job market, you're not supposed to know everything about retirement. So ask somebody, and even if it's only, the $25 a month or whatever they talk about that you can start at the very beginning, just do something. That would be my advice.
Great. Yeah. What do you think, Aaron?
Well, first of all, I would tell them be careful because this was something that I ran into. It's not a big deal now while I'm in college for me to accrue a bunch of debt, because when I get a job, I'll be able to pay it off. And the reality is that that's not as simple as it's not that simple. So one is be careful about debt, and then two is be willing to ask for what you need. And if you don't know what you need, ask some people for some help. And I think that those are big keys. I mean, there was stuff that I put on credit cards knowing that I was going to have a job soon, and then it took me forever to pay that off because I just assumed even if I make this amount of money, that's so much more than what I make now. I'll obviously be able to pay that off in a year, and that's just not reality. When you get out and start living life, you're having to pay rent, and I didn't think about the fact that a scholarship was paying for my apartment and all these different things, and now all that stuff is on me, and so debt crippled my capability to be able to even be willing to look beyond what I had. So that would be, and I'm as critical of Dave Ramsey as anybody for several reasons, but that piece I do agree with is be careful about that. And I'm not just talking about school loans. I'm talking about all the craziness that happens in college that you can run into and just think, oh, when I get a real job, it'll all go away. Because
I want to also, if I could add what Lars talked about, I'm a specialist. I'm not even a generalist in ministry. And I went all in on that pretty early on. I've never done anything else. I've never done any other form of ministry than preaching. And I think part of, if somebody came to me right now and said, I'm thinking of going into ministry, I would say you need to make sure that's not the primary thing that you're resting on to pay the bills your entire career. That if there's a way for you to do this in addition to some other form of work that's going to allow you to not worry about that. Because, Aaron, when you say to ask for what you need, that is not easy to do with church elderships. Right. It's just not. You feel greedy. They can act like you're greedy, or you don't have faith or whatever. No business person is going to treat you like that when you talk about a cost of living raise. Right. And I do think we're entering an era where most churches are not going to be large enough or have enough resources to be your retirement plan, frankly. And so I think thinking through, how could I do this? How could I live a life that matters and have some amount of that life that even during my wage earning years, I'm doing ministry, but I'm not totally dependent on a church for all my financial needs.
I remember having a conversation with Charles Seibert a long time ago, and he said, one of my encouragements for you, and he said this for several reasons, but it was right along those lines, is you might want to educate yourself outside of ministry in some facet, because of the bivocational reality of a lot of the smaller churches just won't be, you won't be able to have a living wage, let alone any benefit of what they can offer you. And so if you want to do ministry, awesome. But there are lots of ways to do ministry without that being your sole source of income. And so find something else you love as well, and do ministry, and make sure that you get educated in that or learn that. And then if you go into ministry, great, and you are able to do it full time, awesome. But educate yourself outside of that as well. Don't just lean there. I mean, I have a MDiv and I'm a roofer, but I'm still using it in other ways,
So. Yeah, totally.
You're a roofer with good theology.
There you go. Yeah,
that matters.
That's great. Awesome. Lars, any closing thoughts, man?
Oh, let's lean into that last moment. The foundation is what we often talk about with theology, right? Being the most important thing as ministers, but the roof matters. And if your house is getting rained on, it's no longer a shelter, even if it's got the best foundation. If it's leaking all over the place, it's rough. So, I mean, I think retirement is part of, maybe it's, the roofing shingles or something. I don't know, but we could go a lot of places with this analogy, but I think that's something worth thinking about. You're not going to be healthy. You're not going to be a non-anxious presence in the world, no matter how good your eschatology is or some of these other things, if you aren't thinking about the practicality of how are you going to provide food and where are you going to get your shelter. And retirement is in our world where we don't have to build our houses often. We have some other experts do that. Money and financial means in retirement. And I think as we live longer, right, that means that we actually get more time on this earth to do kingdom things. But if we can't afford it, we're going to be doing other things and be distracted by that. And so, yeah, I think it's the roof. It's part of the roof, at least, that keeps us able to do God's kingdom work. And it's something we can't, wait on. So thanks for, hammering that home a lot tonight, guys. Was just start now. And so I appreciate you doing that.
I think along with that, though, I mean, having a good foundation is vital. But when I begin to think about this was also a means to provide for my family, there is a sense of security that I, as a father, am called to provide for my family. And so what does that look like? Am I actually putting a roof over my family's head? I mean, I think specifically about my wife, but my kids as well. If they feel insecure in what's happening and so forth, am I really truly providing a good, solidly built house for them? And I think that's a reality there as well.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's good. Hey guys, yeah, we are so over time, but it was a great conversation. Thank you for sharing these 2 hours with us tonight. Again, very appreciative of you both, pastors from the heartland of Church of Christ in the state of Texas. Again, if you've been watching or listening along this episode, we thank you for tuning in, and be on the lookout for one final episode 16, as we conclude this series up pretty soon. Until then, we will see you next time. Goodbye. Once again, thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Almost Essential podcast. If you like what you heard and you want to reach out, you can connect with me, Jordan Koss, on Facebook or Instagram. We hope this series is a valuable resource for you, pastor or otherwise. And remember, you are not almost essential. Your role and service in the church is essential, as well as saving for retirement within your holy vocation and calling.